The roots of science fiction and modern horror are more intertwined than what you may expect, and you can look no further than The Invisible Man for proof of these being two sides of the same coin. Beginning with author H.G. Wells' novel from 1897, it was Universal Pictures who turned a story of ambition and science gone mad into one of the pillars of their studio. Coming quickly after James Whale's Frankenstein, Todd Browning's Dracula, and Carl Freund's The Mummy, it was Whale's return to the monsters with The Invisible Man in 1933 that helped to establish the studio as a home for horror in the 30s. Years later, and the studio would return to the concept for a series of wildly different films that took the general premise in completely different directions for better and worse. But how do you build a franchise around a character you never see? And how do both Wells' novel and Whale's film speak to the push and pull of good and evil within the hearts of man in ways no other Universal monster could? The answer is easily the most unconventional Universal monster series in the history of the studio. Join me as we unveil The Invisible Man, Universal's darkest monster. Alongside Dracula and Frankenstein, The Invisible Man is the third of three Universal monsters to find its origin in classic literature, and that brings our story all the way back to 1897 with the publication of H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man. The Invisible Man was originally published as a serial in Pearson's Weekly and then quickly collected as a book. By this point, Wells had already established himself as a preeminent science fiction author, with works including The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau. In fact, Wells is such a foundational figure in sci-fi that the term didn't even exist at the time, with his works then referred to as scientific romances. Wells' novel follows the story of a scientist that has, obviously, turned himself invisible. But we begin the story with the character, eventually revealed to be named Griffin, as a complete unknown to us, and going on a journey of discovery about how he came to be like this. Structurally, the entire novel is written as if Wells himself had heard about these true events and went about investigating it, learning little by little of who the Invisible Man was and what he did. It's a very patient and subdued book, starting with the character arriving at an English inn to further his experiments, and the innkeeper speculating about what he is there to do. It isn't until chapter 7 of the 28 total chapters that we get the true reveal of the Invisible Man. "You don't understand," he said, "who I am or what I am. I'll show you. By heaven, I'll show you." Then he put his open palm over his face and withdrew it. The center of his face became a black cavity. "Here," he said. He stepped forward and handed Mrs. Hall something which she, staring at his metamorphosed face, accepted automatically. Then, when she saw what it was, she screamed loudly, dropped it, and staggered back. The nose, it was the stranger's nose, pink and shining, rolled on the floor. One important note is that Griffin's initial look from the Universal film is almost exactly as it's described in the novel, with our Invisible Man first appearing at a snow-covered inn wearing a thick coat, high collar, bandaged face, reflective glasses that wrap around the eyes, and a low-slung hat. Obviously, it's all to hide his true nature, but even the fake nose peeking out of the bandages and bits of hair sticking out on top are all part of Griffin's ruse in the novel and movie. One aspect of Wells' novel that I find fascinating, and something I don't think any of the films quite capture, is that the mere presence of an Invisible Man causes a sort of mass hysteria in the people all around him. It's not just Griffin who is changed by his invisibility, but the fear and mind-breaking existence of a man right in front of you who doesn't obey the laws of reality drives entire groups of people into violence and anger. Ultimately, that's the undoing of our unseen figure, but he also brings it on himself. It's about 2/3 of the way into the novel where the Invisible Man reveals himself to Dr. Kemp, a former acquaintance from medical school. From there, we learn that his name is Griffin, as he tells Kemp and the reader all about his experiments and the desperation to survive that came after, turning him against the world and eventually toward murder. At one point, Griffin even outlines how he plans to take over, saying, "The point is, they know there is an Invisible Man, as well as we know there is an Invisible Man. And that Invisible Man, Kemp, must now establish a reign of terror. Yes, no doubt it is startling, but I meant it. A reign of terror. He must take some town like your Burdock and terrify and dominate it. He must issue his orders. He can do that in 1,000 ways. Scraps of paper thrust under doors would suffice. And all who disobey his orders, he must kill. And kill all who would defend them." And by the end, the Invisible Man does attempt to establish a reign of terror, but he doesn't get nearly as far as in the eventual film. Instead, Kemp and the townsfolk coordinate an attack on Griffin that keeps him exhausted and desperate, with a final confrontation seeing the Invisible Man mobbed and killed before he can kill Kemp, turning visible again in death and taking his secrets with him. Everyone saw, faint and transparent as though it was made of glass, so that veins and arteries and bones and nerves could be distinguished, the outline of a hand limp and prone. It grew clouded and opaque even as they stared. Like many of his other works, The Invisible Man is an extremely influential piece of science fiction, going on to inspire many different direct adaptations, new novels that either continue the story or provide their own take on the perils of invisibility, and, of course, the subject of our video. By 1933, Universal Pictures had quickly established themselves as the preeminent house of horror before the coming of the Hays Code. The studio already had their back-to-back hits of Dracula and Frankenstein in 1931, and further cemented themselves with the success of The Mummy in 1932. And so, with producer Carl Laemmle Jr. in search of another topic, the studio turned to H.G. Wells. 1932's Island of Lost Souls from Paramount is the first Wells adaptation, and while it's strange to think of H.G. Wells alive in the time of the motion picture, he actually lived until 1946. And Wells did not like Island of Lost Souls. So when Universal purchased the rights to adapt his Invisible Man novel, the author insisted it be treated with respect and demanded he have script approval before the film could be made. Still, Universal was mostly interested in using the title of the book and Wells' name to drum up publicity for the latest in their line of monsters, with several different screenwriters creating their own scripts based on the broad concept. And that brings us to director James Whale. Just a few years after the success of Frankenstein helped elevate Universal Pictures, the studio wanted Whale to create a sequel to his hit film. Of course, we all know that Whale would eventually give us Bride of Frankenstein. But at this point, the director was not interested in making another Frankenstein at all. Instead, Whale turned to The Invisible Man. It was around this time that Universal also purchased the rights to another Invisible novel, The Murderer Invisible by Philip Wiley, which featured another Invisible Man much more hell-bent on destruction and conquering the world. Together, these two novels were used by author R.C. Sheriff's adaptation for Universal, explaining how Universal's Invisible Man is a more vicious character than Wells' version, but with Sheriff dedicated to respecting Wells' novel. Eventually, with a few changes made to make the script closer to the novel, Wells approved it, and the film was ready to be made. With Whale on board, Boris Karloff was initially set to play Jack Griffin before conflicts with the studio caused him to leave, with Whale instead choosing English actor Claude Rains, who had mostly acted on stage. It was Rains' theatrical and unforgettable voice that led to Whale choosing the actor, as the director knew that he would largely be unseen or heavily disguised, requiring a big personality to counterbalance. The Invisible Man was the American debut of Rains, and here, he puts on one hell of a show. Really, it's all in that big, over-the-top voice, a perfect accompaniment to his spiraling insanity.
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? All right, I'll show you.
Like Wells' novel, our Invisible Man is already transformed by the time the film begins, entering a snowbound inn and eventually revealing his unseen form to the people who continue to bother him. Just lock your door, man. From there, it's essentially the story of Griffin, given the first name Jack here, going more and more mad from his condition, not only becoming violent, but dreaming of conquering the world, and thinking of himself as far beyond human limitations on both power and morals. And what may surprise you is that, despite not being the most outwardly monstrous of the Universal monsters, Jack Griffin is actually the character with the highest body count, killing off many different civilians and police, but really hitting the record by derailing a train and killing more than 100 people in one swoop. It's crazy to witness if you haven't seen the film before, and aren't prepared for the truly homicidal nature of the Invisible Man. There are some new elements added to the story that are essentially the exact same that Whale included in his adaptation of Frankenstein. Like that earlier movie, Whale adds a fiancée, Flora Cranley, played by Gloria Stewart, and a romantic rival in Griffin's assistant, Dr. Kemp, played by William Harrigan. These elements add a romantic and more tragic nature to the story, giving a human layer to this much less humane version of Griffin.
Suddenly I realized the power I held, the power to rule, to make the world grovel at my feet.
Flora and Kemp help us understand that Griffin wasn't always insane, but it was the experiment that drove him crazy. Still, he's villainous from the start, starting out as sympathetic and losing our connection to him as he becomes more and more violent. By the end, there's no other choice but to catch and compromise him to a permanent end, so that no one else can be killed in his rampage. As you'll see with the rest of these films, part of the enjoyment of The Invisible Man and its sequels is in seeing how a still developing film industry created new techniques to believably bring an invisible person to life on film. Here, Wayland special effects supervisor John P. Fulton, who was in charge of the effects for most of the following sequels, used many different techniques to make us buy into Griffin shedding his tangibility and making his presence known without being seen, with the duo spending 2 months on effects work after 2 months of principal photography. And the result is some really wonderful work that still charms and surprises today. Fulton, head of the Universal Effects Department, had a talent in photographic effects that he put to use starting with Browning's Dracula. Explaining the process that brought the Invisible Man to life, Fulton said, "The wire technique could not be used, for the clothes would look empty, and would hardly move naturally, so we had recourse to multiple printing, with variations. Most of these scenes involved other, normal characters, so we photographed these scenes in the normal manner, but without any trace of the Invisible Man. All of the action, of course, had to be carefully timed, as in any sort of double exposure work. The negative was then developed in the normal manner." Fulton and crew created an all-black set using black velvet, with Rains wearing black velvet tights, gloves, and mask, and whatever normal clothes were needed on top. By filming this and combining the negatives with the normal set filming to create the illusion of our Invisible Man in action with the cast. Of course, it was no easy feat, and lighting touch-ups and printing errors resulted in more than 4,000 feet of film being touched up with hand brushing. There's something so wonderful to see it all come to life, even almost a century later. The Invisible Man would be released on November 13th, 1933, and was a huge hit for the studio, making $42,000 in its first week alone. The Universal Monsters had another successful addition to their repertory, but the future would be strange for this series. As I discussed before, the late 1930s saw Universal pause their monsters because of the enforcement of the Hays Code, which put strict guidelines on horror and morality on film. But the re-releases of Dracula and Frankenstein in the late 1930s proved the code essentially wrong. That quickly led to Son of Frankenstein in 1933, and its success essentially spurred on the next decade of Universal monster movies. Up first, The Invisible Man Returns, released on January 12, 1940, and directed by Joe May, with a screenplay by Lester K. Cole and Kurt Siodmak, best known for writing The Wolfman. And while the film was made to quickly cash in on one of the monsters that helped establish the studio almost a decade before, The Invisible Man Returns sets an important precedent for every sequel in the series. Each stars a different character with only a minor connection to a previous movie, with each invisible person reacting differently to their power, and each movie having a very different tone and sometimes an entirely different genre. The Invisible Man Returns went through several hands in pre-production and many different stars considered for the role, before a young Vincent Price was chosen after starring in Universal's Tower of London. And even at a young age and unseen until the last few minutes, his distinctive voice is a great choice to follow up Rains, giving personality and pathos when there is very little physical emoting.
I shall have worshippers and followers, people who will obey me because they recognize my greatness. Those who are loyal will be rewarded, and the others destroyed.
Here, Price is Jeffrey Radcliffe, who escapes his wrongful execution for the murder of his brother when he's turned invisible by Dr. Frank Griffin, the suddenly introduced brother of the original Invisible Man. And much like the first film, Jeffrey has a fiancée, Helen, who, along with Frank, is helping him to find the people who killed his brother and framed him. Compared to the first film, Invisible Man Returns is a more tragic story because our main character is an innocent man pushed into these circumstances. The invisibility serum isn't taken for selfish reasons, but out of desperation, only for Jeffrey to slowly go mad from its effects. The entire film is a race for Jeffrey to find the true murderers, and a race for Frank and Helen to reverse the effects before he goes completely insane. But it also has a happy ending, with our new Invisible Man acquitted of the crime and cured of his invisibility just in the nick of time, reuniting with his love and hopefully living happily ever after. There's a much more traditional climax here, with Jeffrey chasing after the man that framed him and getting justice in the end. It also touches on one of the fears of Wells' book, but something not really discussed in the first film. If an invisible man is injured and needs surgery, they're essentially doomed, as Jeffrey is shot and must be saved from his blood loss. Eventually, we discover that a blood transfusion is the cure to invisibility, bringing him back to normal and, like the first film, finally showing Vincent Price on screen after only being heard since the beginning. With a budget of $243,000 and 27 days to shoot, the byproduct of Universal being financially strapped during World War II and looking to make fast profits on their sequels during this era, a lot of the effects within The Invisible Man Returns done by Fulton don't stack up to the original movie. However, there are some pretty good moments. In particular, the film tries something new, with the transformation back to visibility at the end being pretty impressive, with veins, muscles, and skin coming back in layers. But production was difficult on Returns, with the film almost immediately running behind schedule, and with director May having much bigger ambitions than what Universal anticipated. In the end, the film went several days over schedule and $15,000 over budget. Overall, I'd say Returns is the most like the first film out of any other that followed in the series, with a lot of characters playing the exact same type of roles, only with the sentiment toward our Invisible Man and his eventual fate flipped. In the end, Returns is a solid sequel, not reaching the highs of the Frankenstein sequels, but much better than the repetitive late Mummy movies. And it was a hit too, making $815,000 and spurring on the next entry by the end of the same year. Maybe the biggest swerve of any classic Universal monster movie, December 27th, 1940 saw the release of The Invisible Woman. A woman in a movie. Oh my god, woke Hollywood must have created a time machine and traveled back 85 years to mess with history. The Invisible Woman is directed by A. Edward Sutherland and written by Robert Lees, Fred Ronaldo, and Gertrude Purcell, with a story by Kurt Siodmak and Joe May. The result of several behind-the-scenes changes that saw actress Margaret Sullivan originally cast to star and fulfill a contract with Universal but refusing to film, leading to lawsuits, court orders, and lots of casting changes. Alongside the major break from the style of the films that came before, Invisible Woman also has essentially no connections. Here, fashion model Kitty Carroll, played by Virginia Bruce, is selected by Professor Gibbs, John Barrymore, to be the first person to test out his invisibility machine. Yeah, that's right, no serum, just crazy electricity. And before you know it, our Invisible Woman is wrapped up in a plot with gangsters trying to steal the machine for their own gain, and a romance while she also gets back at the boss who fired her. It's all played for easy laughs with just a touch of risque humor for the time. I mean, golly, this lady's naked. And while obviously not showing anything, it's used to create some romantic tension with her male co-star. The two eventually get together and have a baby who can turn invisible by the end, with this film showing the cure to invisibility being alcohol. Sure, I guess. You get me drunk enough, I'd probably think I could turn invisible too. It's fun, but it's also the biggest outlier in the series. Kitty has no worries of going mad, and she doesn't want to murder anyone, which is nice, but it's also completely outside of the rest of the films, making it easy to exclude. This time, Universal realized the effects needed for invisibility needed extra cash, giving the film a $300,000 budget, which was met with decent success in a $660,000 box office. It's the type of success that proves Universal had established themselves and the Invisible series enough to allow big changes from film to film, and even more changes were on the way. Next up is Invisible Agent, directed by Edwin L. Mayer and written by Kurt Siodmak, released on July 31st, 1942. The film stars John Hall as Frank Raymond Griffin, the grandson of the original Invisible Man. Okay, when did he get someone pregnant? And possessor of the invisibility formula. But when Griffin is targeted by foreign agents looking to steal the formula to power the Axis armies, Griffin escapes and parachutes into Nazi Germany as an invisible agent, where he fights back and falls in love with British spy Maria Sorensen, Ilona Massey. It all becomes a race against time to stop the Nazis' bomber attack on New York City, which was basically impossible during World War II. The United States' distance from other nations across the Atlantic made an attack extremely difficult due to the need for aircraft carriers to close the massive distance, and fortified the country's position as a powerful ally in the war. Oh, sorry, I got on a World War II tangent. Yes, Invisible Agent falls into that niche of all niches: horror wartime propaganda. By this point, the US was fully engulfed in World War II, and essentially every Hollywood studio was making wartime movies. With Universal already succeeding with their horror revival, why not combine the two? But it's a strange blend. Siodmak, who was a Jewish refugee that fled the Nazis and whose experience inspired the Wolfman, makes sure to cut down the Nazi ideology throughout the film. But Invisible Agent is a much more lighthearted and fun adventure than you'd expect. The Nazis are mostly buffoons, and our heroic Griffin is more prankster than soldier. But even then, moments like Peter Lorre disemboweling his Nazi partner and then committing seppuku are kinda brutal. Personally speaking, I think Invisible Agent has a great concept, pushing into action-adventure more than the past thriller or horror approaches. And there's a lot of promise to a story of a soldier using the invisibility serum to fight back against the Nazis. But I think this movie is just okay. Invisible Agent is a lot more about the gags and slapstick than the action or adventure, and the movie kinda suffers for it. It's the sort of pulp adventure that could work really well, and was done much better in something like The Rocketeer decades later, but instead is limited by the budget and skills of its crew. When combined with Fulton's effects being a bit of a downgrade here, like Griffin slathering himself in cold cream to be visible, it just doesn't quite do it for me. But for whatever you might think about its horror propaganda blend, Invisible Agent was a big hit, making more than $1 million at the box office and becoming the biggest hit of any of the Invisible sequels, spurring on more. Of all the Universal Monsters series, The Invisible Man is easily the most flexible in its tone and style. With the release of The Invisible Man's Revenge on June 9th, 1944, the franchise finally came back to horror. Directed by Ford Beebe and written by Bertram Milhauser, The Invisible Man's Revenge sees Robert Griffin, played by John Hall, and with the character not having any connection to previous characters besides a shared last name, an escaped mental patient looking for revenge on the family that betrayed him to take control of the diamond fields they discovered together, a kinda complicated setup that happens all before the movie starts. Both Griffin and his enemies are unsympathetic characters, with his enemy's daughter Julie and her fiancé Mark as the heroes. But Griffin is psychotic from the start. No need for the serum to drive him mad, and giving this film an ultra-dark anti-hero. The true horror of Invisible Man's Revenge comes from the film smartly using Return's reveal of blood transfusions in a terrifying way. Here, Griffin uncovers that transfusions will restore his visibility, but only temporarily. So our villain drains the blood of his victims, making him normal again to continue his plans, but soon turning an albino white and becoming invisible again like what Wells had described in his book. In essence, this Griffin becomes a vampire alongside an Invisible Man, making him as much of a monster as Rain's version. But with the central character once again back in the villainous role, it becomes a story of stopping him, which is surprisingly rare in the larger scope of the series. By the end, his reign of terror is stopped, and our love interest is saved, when the vengeful dog of this film's murdered scientist brutally kills Griffin in the finale. There isn't much here that's new in terms of effects, except for one advancement you may not have noticed without knowing about it. The camera actually moves when our Invisible Man is on screen. It may not seem like much, but it's a sign of the technological advancement happening at the time. And even though there wouldn't be many other films to push the Invisible Man effects forward after this, it's cool to see. Really, part of the fun that comes from watching these films is to see how the crews come up with new ways to portray invisibility, and how they pull it off. Or, in some cases, fail. Some sequels have fun with a big reveal of the see-through character, with clothes and bandages falling off their form. Others are content to simply have their cast act against an empty set, with voiceover filling in for the character. It's all a matter of time, money, and inspiration. A combination that was in constant flux as Universal continued to crank out their monster sequels as World War II raged on. In the span of 5 years, Universal had made 4 Invisible Man sequels, essentially exhausting the concept in their bid to stay profitable. It's really crazy to look at the big picture here, as the Wolfman, Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Mummy were all also revived, heavily sequelized, and essentially done by 1945, with the monster mash of House of Dracula. And although most of the other major monsters were brought together in films like Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and House of Frankenstein, the Invisible Man was left out. That's probably because these films had moved the setting far out of the pre-industrial revolution time period of these other monster movies, and also because there was no singular Invisible Man to use. Really, the only crossover this series ever had came at the end of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948, with Vincent Price once again voicing the character for a very brief but super fun gag to close the film.
There's nobody to frighten us anymore.
Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping to get in on the excitement.
Who said that?
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man.
3 years later, and our unseen monster would have his final classic appearance in Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, released on April 3rd, 1951. Like most every Abbott and Costello movie, Meet the Invisible Man has the comedic duo playing a different pair of friends. Here they're Lou Francis and Bud Alexander, who have graduated from private detective school and are put on the case of boxer Tommy Nelson, played by Arthur Franz, who has been framed for the murder of his manager and has taken the invisibility serum to find the people who did it. So yeah, it's basically the plot of Invisible Man Returns, but repurposed for comedic effect and with a boxing angle added. Technically, it's all in line with the films that came before, with the film acknowledging Jack Griffin as the creator of the serum who went mad from it, but nothing else mentioned. And once again, a blood transfusion is shown to be the cure, with Costello getting into some temporary invisibility hijinks to close the show. In the end, I think Meet the Invisible Man is really fun. It sorta drags in the first half with a strangely very plot-heavy focus on a silly comedy, but once it gets its setup out of the way, the film starts throwing out a lot of great gags. The big boxing match, with Costello forced to fight and helped out by our Invisible Man blocking punches and throwing haymakers, is really funny. It may not be quite as good as Meet Frankenstein, but it's definitely better than Meet the Mummy, with the comedic duo fully back in their late career heyday at this point. And with that, the Invisible Man would disappear, and just a few films later, the classic Universal monsters would be gone. Universal's Invisible Man may have made his presence last known in 1951, but given that any studio could either directly adapt Wells' work or make their own unique story of an Invisible Man, there were many other similar stories that hit screens in the decades that followed. While the Invisible Man is one of the few Universal monsters to not receive a new version from Hammer Film Productions, Daiei Film in Japan made their own series, with The Invisible Man Appears, The Invisible Man vs. the Human Fly, and The Invisible Avenger from the late 40s through early 50s, as well as a Soviet version of The Invisible Man in 1984. Alongside these were different Invisible Man TV series, ranging from a British show in 1958 through a Sci-Fi Channel series in 2000. But these are just the ones directly spinning off from H.G. Wells' novel. John Carpenter's Memoirs of an Invisible Man, Paul Verhoeven's Hollow Man, and more would have never happened without Wells' novel and Universal's adaptations. But across the century, it's become such a broad concept that a scientifically created invisible person gone mad with power has become its own concept. Like the rest of the Universal monsters, the Invisible Man has popped up in many commercials, adaptations, merchandise, and theme park attractions created in association with Universal, but not nearly as many as his fellow pillars of horror. I mean, the poor guy didn't even show up in the Monster Squad. And I think that's largely because the character's signature ability makes him the hardest to easily convey. The bandaged look with goggles is pretty recognizable, but how exactly do you make a character you can't see into a merchandisable figure? And I think that's why the Invisible Man, while given just as many movies as his contemporaries during the 30s and 40s, has fallen far behind basically every other classic monster in terms of mainstream recognition and iconography, hoping to put some life back into their dark universe.
He said that wherever I went, he would find me, walk right up to me, and I wouldn't be able to see him.
Adrian is dead.
He's not dead. He has figured out a way to be invisible.
It's a Universal Monsters retrospective, so of course we're going to talk about the Dark Universe, but by now you probably already know the deal, so let's make it quick. The release of the modern action-focused new take on The Mummy in 2017 launched Universal's plan for a cinematic monster universe, with the studio quickly announcing many upcoming projects, including an Invisible Man film starring Johnny Depp and to be written by Ed Solomon. But The Mummy's critical and commercial failure also meant the vision was dead after only one entry. In the aftermath, Universal looked for a new approach to their monsters, and partnered with horror-focused studio Blumhouse Productions for new takes on their characters. The first result of this partnership was The Invisible Man, written and directed by Leigh Whannell, most famous at this point for his partnership with James Wan and their creation of the Saw and Insidious franchises. Here, Whannell creates a new take on the Invisible Man in a story focused on Cecilia Cass, played by Elizabeth Moss, who escapes from her abusive relationship with Adrian Griffin, the founder of an optics engineering company. Soon after she runs away and hides out with her childhood friend, C receives the news that Adrian has committed suicide and left her $5 million. However, strange events and accidents start happening all around Cecilia, leading her to believe that Adrian is still alive and has used his technology to become invisible. Of all the films on this list, Whannell's Invisible Man is by far the most frightening. It's a really tense film that forces you to question what you saw, and what might actually be happening. Whannell and cinematographer Stefan Duccio fill the film with quiet, patient, long shots, drawing your eyes to empty space and making you wonder if someone is actually right in front of you. Of course, being an Invisible Man movie, it's not much of a spoiler to say that yes, Griffin is really there, with the sci-fi secret this time not being a body-altering serum, but a high-tech bodysuit covered in hundreds of cameras that record and project the surroundings on the body to make him see-through. The other biggest change is that, unlike most of the other Universal predecessors, the invisible person here is not the main character, but is instead the unseen villain. Instead, it's Cecilia who's in full focus, with Elizabeth Moss essentially in every single scene, and her mental torment the driving force of the film. And she puts on a hell of a performance. Completely unglamorous, full of desperation, and really convincing at showing how someone can be broken apart by a partner and find the strength to leave. This is a story of abuse and its effects on survivors who have no one to believe them. And by the end, it's a brutal story with lots of twists, turns, and confrontations that escalate the film from a tale of paranoia to a hyper-violent confrontation that ends up being both satisfying and very grim. Cecilia's use of the suit to kill Griffin in a staged suicide is really dark, with Griffin essentially continuing his mind games and abuse until the very end. The Invisible Man would be released on February 28, 2020, and despite being essentially the last big movie released before the COVID-19 pandemic shut down movie theaters, it managed to be a big hit, with a $144 million box office against its $7 million budget, which likely would have been even higher had the pandemic not happened. But it's been strange times for the Universal monsters since. I've talked about this in other videos, but despite 5 years passing, the only other Universal monster movie that's been made is Whannell's modern take on The Wolfman. Released at the beginning of 2025, and besides being not good, it also only made $35 million against its $25 million budget. Outside of that, there's been discussion of an Invisible Woman remake by Elizabeth Banks, an Invisible Man sequel with Moss, and various other new takes on the monsters in collaboration with Blumhouse. But nothing's happened yet. The only real development is the upcoming Dark Universe land in the brand new Epic Universe theme park in Florida. But there's been no mention of the Invisible Man's presence at the park so far. It's likely that the character will make some sort of cameo, but like always, not being able to really see this character makes him hard to market. Unless one of those sequels gets made, I think we've seen the last of Universal's take on the Invisible Man for a while. But it's such a compelling idea that plays with our morals and self-insert fantasies that, despite being impossible to see, the Invisible Man will never be far from our minds. And as I do with every retrospective, here's every Invisible Man movie ranked from worst to best. At 7, The Invisible Woman. I didn't expect a screwball romantic comedy in my Invisible Man series when I started this retrospective, but here we are. I don't think there's any outright bad Invisible Man movie, but The Invisible Woman is definitely the least of all of them. There's nothing here that isn't done better in other Invisible movies or other romantic comedies of the era. In the end, I think this is an interesting little side tangent for the series to go on, and it's definitely a recommendation for anyone looking to fill out their watch of the Invisible Man series, but it's nothing more than that. At 6, Invisible Agent, a fairly standard and well-made wartime movie that's more about the gags and romance than it is about the thrills. It's fun to see the invisible formula used by someone that doesn't go crazy and is a hero, but there's a lot to this concept that's left unused here. It's, like I said in the video, something that I would find done a lot better in The Rocketeer decades later, and I love The Rocketeer. I just wish this was done a lot better than it was. At 5, Abbott and Costello meet the Invisible Man. A lot of great gags and a lot of fun ideas here, but it does start a little too slow, and a little too plot heavy for something that is just a comedy after all. However, I do think it gets genuinely funny in the second half, with the card game and the boxing match in particular being really funny. I feel like this is the crew using the last bits of Invisible Man effects and gags that they hadn't used yet in other films, and putting them to use for comedic purposes, which is fun to watch unfold on screen. At 4, The Invisible Man returns. Almost every Universal monster movie struggles with how to do sequels because, for the most part, all the original movies end with the monster dead. So, do you do the same thing over and over again, or do you push into a brand new direction? The Invisible Man Returns really sets the precedent for the rest of these sequels because it does truly push this franchise into a new direction. We have a brand new protagonist, a brand new tone, and new ways to approach this concept, with our Invisible Man not being a villain but a sympathetic hero. It's not quite as iconic as the original and not as unpredictable, but it's a solid continuation. At 3, The Invisible Man's Revenge. I like this a lot more than I expected when I was researching this retrospective. Having our central character become invisible 30 minutes in is probably a little too long, but I like how this movie depicts his spiraling madness, both before and after the serum. Plus, using the blood transfusion as the cause of an even darker story, with our Invisible Man draining his victims of their blood to become visible again, and essentially also becoming a vampire, is the cause of a lot of great macabre aspects of this story. At 2, The Invisible Man from 1933. A very unconventional movie in the larger context of the Universal monsters. I really love everything that's done with the Invisible Man here because it makes him a much more human and much scarier antagonist than a lot of the other monster movies of the time. I've talked about this in other videos before, but I find that there is some degree of relatability to almost every other Universal monster. They're sympathetic and often are not the cause of everything horrible that happens in the story, but instead become much more of a victim. Here, Claude Rains as Jack Griffin is not really sympathetic at all. He starts out already invisible, which prevents us from feeling a lot of emotion for him, and he just becomes worse and worse and worse. This is a story about what it takes to become a truly horrible person, and what happens when someone thinks they're better than the world around them. Claude Rains is putting in a fantastic performance, and there's enough of that cheeky comedy that happens in a lot of James Whale's movies because he's using a lot of his supporting cast from past films. That adds a layer of comedy that I think is kind of unexpected, and it makes the dark turns that happen in this story even darker. Plus, the special effects here are really fantastic to watch unfold, even when you know how they're all done, and when you can see some of the seams. Even with just one actual appearance as the Invisible Man, Jack Griffin is a great Universal monster. And at number 1, The Invisible Man from 2020. Despite how many big changes are made in Leigh Whannell's film, I think this is the most effective of the series. It's a smart change to have our focus be on the victim of a man gone mad with power instead of that man himself. And that really makes us become sympathetic to the victim rather than the victimizer. It also means that we're subject to the mind games that Griffin is pulling at the same time, and makes us choose how much we sympathize with Cecilia or not. Given that the sci-fi concept here is a high-tech suit instead of a serum, we are making a lot of changes to H.G. Wells' novel, but all the same, it's about someone that makes a massive breakthrough in science and ends up going mad because of it. I really love Whannell's patient direction, which uses a lot of slow-moving shots, still images, and empty space to make us question what's actually happening on screen. And Elizabeth Moss puts in a fantastic performance as a woman driven over the edge from her abuse. Whether there are more sequels to this or not, I hope that there are a lot more Universal Monster movies to come that use this as inspiration for how to do monsters in the 21st century. And with that, we're once again at the end of the history of another Universal monster. And what I found so fascinating about the Invisible Man series is its complete flexibility, maybe more so than any other horror franchise I've covered on my channel. It's not always a total success, but it's always unexpected. But at its best, it's a story about the war between good and evil in our hearts, and what it takes for someone to completely give in to their darkest urges. And that battle will always be with us, and so will the Invisible Man, somewhere just out of sight. Thanks for watching today's video in the latest in my long-running line of Universal Monsters retrospectives. If you've been following the channel or have been doing some catch-up recently, then you probably know that I am a huge Universal Monsters fan, and have been slowly covering every single monster that is part of that franchise, giving each of them their own dedicated video. And with the coverage of The Invisible Man, that leaves only one Universal Monster franchise left to cover: Dracula, the one that started it all. So expect that one a little bit later in the year. As for the Invisible Man franchise, prior to making this video, I was never the biggest fan, and had actually only seen the original and the 2020 remake. So making this video was a chance for me to get caught up on a lot of blind spots with this series. And I really did enjoy going through those movies. The most surprising thing, and what I touched on throughout the video, is how each movie really does its own thing with the concept of an invisible person, going from light to dark, from serious to comedy, and switching genres a few times even, which is very unexpected if all you know is the original and the remake. It also gave me the opportunity to read H.G. Wells' novel for the first time, and I thought it was a really great classic science fiction novel. Reading it was very enlightening to see how much it truly influenced over the years. And while I ranked the remake at number 1 and the original at number 2, it's really a toss-up for me between those two. And Claude Rains' performance as the Invisible Man is just such a classic piece of over-the-top acting, which works really well for this style of horror. By the end, he is a more sympathetic character, but he's still an outright villain all the way from beginning to end. Easily one of the most monstrous of the monsters. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Invisible Man series, and your own rankings of the films, as well as where you would put the Invisible Man series within the larger canon of the Universal Monsters. For me, it's above The Mummy, but below Creature, Frankenstein, and The Wolfman. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a patron or member, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews, with the latest one being a combination book and movie review of The Running Man. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and not tampering with the laws of science.